Tonight we have with you people that live very different lives but come together beautifully like a puzzle, or in our case like a mosaic. So the conversation is going to be led by the Miami Herald's religion reporter, Lauren Costantino, and then we're going to have Debra Albo-Steiger, the CEO of the Children's Bereavement Center, Senior Reverend Juan del Hierro from Unity on the Bay, and Kristina Reinis, who is a historian and an artist. So without further ado, I'd like to bring our flight attendant for the evening, Lauren Costantino, and the panelists. Let's put our hands together.
Are we going to have to project to the back of the house, as they said in the film? Maybe not. Mic seems to be working. Awesome. Well, I'm so excited to be speaking with you all. I think this is our first time all seeing the film. And, you know, I know that, and I'll just jump right into it. We are going to have some time to ask our audience for some questions or thoughts, but, you know, I just wanted to kind of start with Debra, a question for you. And, you know, I know the film is fictional. The family is a real family in real life, but I'm wondering if there is anything in the film that stuck out to you as realistic. You know, you deal with, in your work, with a lot of families who are grieving and, you know, providing resources for children and families. And, you know, whether it was like the emotion of the mother or the anger of the father, or, you know, the daughter acting out. I'm just wondering if there's anything that struck you as like realistic in this film that you see in your work. And that could be for anyone, but I want to start with Debra.
Thank you. That's a great question. So just a little introduction. I'm Debra Albo-Steiger. I'm the CEO of Children's Bereavement Center and our Lift from Loss adult programming. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker. I practice as a therapist. And yes, they acted that quite well. There's so much of that movie that you see grief in a way that we as human beings experience from childhood on up to adulthood. And one of the things that we always explain with CBC is that our goal is to provide free grief support to children, teens, and adults after the loss of a loved one due to death. And we encourage people to come together. And the one scene, so many, but one of the scenes that stuck out was when Dan was able to finally verbalize what had happened to the other actors and how they came over and they put their hands on him. That is such a powerful thing, to have people who finally understand and hear your story. And that's why, you know, for us at CBC, being able to really get people to understand, you have to share that grief that nobody should grieve alone. And they were so raw in that. And the other part is as a child, you know, you're watching this movie from the beginning and you're thinking, what is wrong with her, right? Like, nobody understands because nobody's talking about it. And it is often the case that if the parents are not talking about the loss, you're going to see that child act out, right? And she said it so beautifully. I'm sad. You know, she's saying all of these things, but without her dad verbalizing that in the beginning, and without her, she didn't know if it was okay. And famous line nowadays, it's okay not to be okay, right? But that wasn't what, so they did such a fantastic job. And the fact that they are, and if you heard that, in real life, that is mother and father and child. So that shone through the screen, at least for me, because those emotions were so raw.
Yeah. Do you have anything you want to add to that? Yeah.
I can. So it was really interesting how we all did come together, and we have our own different experiences around grief. As a minister at Unity on the Bay, I've held space for people that are moving through grief. And then also as a father, my adopted son, his biological mother, who he never met, passed away a few years ago. And we went through the process of sharing that with him and seeking counseling on how to navigate that. And one of the things that I just connected with in the movie is how everybody experiences grief in their own way, and there's no right or wrong way. And, you know, my 7-year-old son was grieving a biological mother he never met. And it was sometimes difficult to understand just how deep those emotions were. But the understanding that we all have our own way of processing it and of living through it, at the same time as it's such a human experience. There's a song by Jason Mraz. It says the irony of loneliness is what it's called. And it's like the irony of loneliness is that we all experience it. At the moment we realize that we're all experiencing it, maybe we won't feel as lonely. And so it's like a shared experience, but also such a individualized experience. And just knowing that and giving ourselves the space for that, I think is a really powerful thing.
Okay, I guess we're already going into our personal experiences, so might as well start it off with that. But yes, I'm an artist, I'm a historian, which was initially why I was invited to this panel, but I actually also lost my brother at the age of 13, so this resonated with me really deeply, and I think seeing the expression and feeling of the daughter, I had this feeling of like, I wish I acted that way. Which was a really interesting emotion to have because I think I felt this deep responsibility to be very stable for my family and to be very calm and not to add any more grief. And so it was interesting as someone who's experienced my own like sudden loss within my family at a young age to see someone act out and almost like an enviousness for that emotion. But I think that represents that grief needs to be felt. You know, and it needs to be acknowledged, and that's what you see in this film that this family works through, is they get to a point where they can speak to it and that they can acknowledge it, and yeah, I think that's a lot of what this panel is about, right? Is being present in the feelings of it, and so I think that was a really interesting emotion that came up for me, but also an acknowledgement as well.
Christine, I'm going to punt it right back to you in a second, but yeah, I think you all brought up really great points. Thank you for being so vulnerable and sharing your personal experiences with grief. I think it's really clear in the film that all three characters who are grieving are going through very different stages of grief or just different emotions at different times, and even though they're a family, could be feeling somewhat alone. And it's clear that they're all kind of dealing with it in different ways, and you know, the father, I guess, I don't know if he chooses, you know, it seems like the woman with Rita with short hair kind of chooses him, but he falls into this theater performing art like hobby, which he seemed to have no business doing at first. But I'm wondering, like, Christina, what's your experience with like art therapy and using art as a form of therapy and being able to grieve through art and maybe feel emotion through art? I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit to that.
So I never had art therapy formally, but because I know you can speak to maybe that once I pass the mic over, as like from a clinician perspective. But as an artist, as a kid who was very in the arts, my parents, as soon as they saw me grieving, they were like, put her in art camps. They like immediately brought me to the arts. It was a thing I was already very attached to and something that kind of guided me through my life. But this movie was making me think about that so I got very into representational art. So very like, you know, you see a photo and you try to copy it. And when I was like 15, this might have been a year and a half after my brother passed, I like spent a year on a really detailed oil painting of both of us, like when we were very little. And I think at the time I didn't think about it too deeply, but it was really this meditative thing that allowed me to really sit with the emotion and the grief. You know, when you lose someone, there's this like immediate grief and panic that they're gone. But then as time passes, there's almost this guilt and there's this grief about forgetting who they were in that immediate space. And so I think even at like 15, I was feeling that. And I started pouring into the arts as a way to try to capture that. I'm like, if I can get this like paint stroke on his eye just perfect, then like it'll be fine. And of course, like, you know, I continued to grieve and continued to feel, but by practicing that meditative state with art, it was something, and it's something I continue in my own practice now. Still do a lot of representational work. I do work that goes outside of that and a lot to do with like play and identity, but I think that is my basis it really allowed space to reflect in which I didn't feel rushed to be okay with it. And I was able to take my time with grief. And I think you see that in the film, to bring it back to that, you know? He's able to really embody the feelings of his son and able to step into that role. But I know you actually have 2 art therapists that you work with, so I feel like you can speak to more of that clinical thing, but yes. Did you want to go first?
So yes, we have art therapists and music therapists that are part of our team. And what's incredible is watching, when we started 25 years ago, obviously our name was Children's Bereavement Center, we started with just children. And over 25 years, we have definitely, through Lift from Loss, added an adult component. And what's incredible is how our art and music therapists have actually gone into often now, because they ask for it, go into the adult groups. And it is very meaningful having that ability, because in some ways it makes it easier, right? So for him, he couldn't talk about, Dan couldn't talk about loss, right? It was too much, it was too hard. He would get up, storm out. When he started acting it, and especially a play that was so in line with what had happened in his life with his own son, it's those feelings started to come up. And at first it was really uncomfortable and it was difficult, but over time he really was able to work through it. So art and music and therapy, there is something called drama therapy, if you're not aware, but there's art and music and drama therapy so that you can work through it together. And I also like to be a little vulnerable. So my dad died 10 months ago very suddenly of a heart attack. I saw him 3 days before he was fine and he died, and I'm still 10 months later grieving. When I first joined CBC, I was a facilitator. We have a facilitator in our audience for many years. And as Midge knows, being a facilitator is a beautiful thing because we're grief support groups. So what happens in the grief support groups is a facilitator is just facilitating. We're letting the peers talk to each other, be it the children to each other or the adults. And so as a facilitator, I was able to learn that. My dad dies, I go to my first group for what we call candlelighting. And for the first time, I was on the other side of it. I was a participant there to remember my dad. And the art and music therapist came to that particular night. And it was so beautiful. I mean, I cannot say enough. And I recently saw the art therapist that was there, and she said, you know, I could just tell how much you were into that work because you were remembering your dad. And it was just so wonderful to see. So when you talk about art and music and drama being a part of the healing process, it is so much the truth, and it opens your heart. Now, so for some people that's too much, right? So what do? They'll go into sports, and they'll dive into exercise, and that's okay too. It could be yoga. It just has to be something that you're willing to go towards. And I love what you just said, because remembering your loved one, that's what we do, right? That's what we have to do. And it took Dan a really long time to be able to do that. And he's like, well, we talk about him all the time. But when she really pushed him on it, then he really got inside of his son's head, and it was just so beautiful.
I really appreciated the fact that it was acting that was shown in the movie. I just remember, you know, a lot of times I feel that we put so much stress on ourselves about how we're supposed to move through life and how we're supposed to move through very difficult things. And as I said, we've been saying earlier, everybody has their own process, everybody has their own time, everybody moves through it the best way that they can. And I remember speaking with somebody who was being very hard on themselves for, I should get over this, or I shouldn't be in this place, or, you know, I didn't remember this, right? And I remember just saying, like, so if somebody were saying those things to you, like, put yourself in those shoes, like, sort of like the actor, you know, the dad was putting himself in the shoes of Romeo, right? Like, put yourself in those shoes, like, what would you say to yourself? And most of us would say, it's okay, right? Like, you're doing the best that you can. You'll move through this the best way that you can and really create a space of compassion. And so many times it's us who fail to give ourselves compassion through the process. So I really just, I like that invitation to look at ourselves from the outside perspective through the eyes. And there was a line that I actually took my phone out. I know we're not supposed to, but it was just such a great line. I think it was Rita said, don't anticipate, just feel the love. Don't anticipate how it's supposed to be. Don't anticipate how you're supposed to show up. Just feel the love in that moment, you know, and grief being just another word for the experience of loving.
Amazing. Thank you all for those great answers. This is a really good panel. Like you all are very experts in your own field. Something I noticed in the film, and something that I've also dealt with in my former career as a teacher, teaching high schoolers, was like the realness of high school love and like young love and tragedy, which is obviously represented in Romeo and Juliet, but also in the story of the family and the son who died and, you know, his girlfriend. There's some really like tough scenes that we see when they're going through the deposition. And I'm just wondering like what this film is trying to say in your interpretation about like the reality of young love and emotion, and kind of, you know, how that's realistic in today's like day and age with social media, and just like everybody remembers being in high school and feeling very real emotions. If you know anything about high schoolers, they don't play around. Like when, you know, like when they're in love, they're in love. But, you know, as an adult, we have a different perspective on that. So I'm just wondering like what this film is trying to say about young people and their perception of love and tragedy. Like, is that really happening in high schools? Like, is that, you know, is this a dramatization, or is that really like what's going on nowadays?
So that's a tough question, and I have 2 teenagers, so it's definitely tough. I would say, yeah. So I would say this, and I mean we all know we were all teenagers at one point. There's in our bodies. I mean, there's hormones, there's growing, and there's all of those things that are happening, and there definitely are big feelings. And it is interesting watching my 2 kids because social media and how that affects everybody. So. I'll start with the movie. So in the movie, obviously you have a couple who's very much in love and ends up going the very, very scary route of suicide, which by the way, noticed too, but they didn't say that word for a very long time in the movie. That is also very common. It is to this day, suicide is something that's not discussed. It should be discussed. We work very closely with our partners at NAMI Miami, NAMI Broward, and NAMI Palm Beach County. So I always recommend people to look into different trainings because it is very important to talk about suicide, and also the finality of it. You know, she didn't mean to wake up either. She said that, right? So that part is also very real and something we should discuss. From our perspective as parents and grandparents and teachers and aunts and uncles and everything in the room that you are, with what I try to do as a parent is, it's very hard. My kids will often say to me, "Don't use your therapy voice on me, mommy." Get that a lot. You know, you have to, and this is tough, but the listening is really important. And people will say you gotta listen, but actually listen. Putting the phones down and pointing it out to the kids, right? Like, what are you looking at on your phone, and what does that mean? And the part that always gets me with my kids is like the likes. This like they're always about that somebody needs to show them. Now when we were younger, it was people saying stuff to us or the way they acted. Now it's like this phone and they're clicking on it. So when you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend or whomever, a partner, and you're looking for that kind of satisfaction and you're getting it through your phone, and it's really a lot of feelings that it's overwhelming. So what to do? I was like, we just don't talk about problems, but what to do. So number one, you know, you as a family, you have that rule, like no phones at the table, for example, or you have the meals together, you go out, you do things together, and you ask questions. You know, tell me about your partner. Tell me if you have a partner. Just talk to me about your partner. Talk to me about your friends. And it's amazing how often as parents, just asking open-ended questions. Don't ask closed-ended questions like, do you have a boyfriend? That is a bad question to ask. Tell me about your friends, right? Tell me what you're interested in doing. What did you do today? Don't ask, did you have a good day? Because we all know the answer to that one. Like, I'm not answering your question, Mom. No. But it's just about really connecting, because those feelings are really large, and they're going to have a hard time controlling those feelings, period. But then also being honest with them and saying, I have a lot of big feelings too. And even though I'm your mom, I'm not perfect. And I have no idea how to handle my feelings sometimes. So that's part of it, because really, like, what teenagers don't want to hear is you have a lot of hormones, and no, I do not say that to my children. What you say to them is, I'm a human being too, you're a human being, let's just talk. And as far as love is concerned, it's really not diminishing it. Never ever say to a child, well, you're just in high school, you'll learn. When you grow up, no child wants to hear that. No, because at that moment, that person in their life is the most important person. So you have to start at their level. And that is just so, and showing them love, just showing them, I'm here for you.
My son is too young, he's 11 right now, to tell me stop ministering to me, but I get that from my husband.
Okay.
But I'll wait, so he's entering middle school, and it's interesting because we have been pretty good about him not being on social media, and he texts with friends. And something that I didn't realize that happens is also you're invited to this text group, then somebody kicks you out of the text group, and then you're not allowed, and you're begging to go back in, and you create it. It's just a really challenging space, I think, for kids. And even this morning, there was something going on at home, and I try to be as mindful as possible in how Lucas can internalize things, about friends. So love, with love and those intimate relationships, yes, and also just with friends and friendships, and how that really, social media, the cell phones, all of that plays into it. It's a challenging space, and I think that one of the things that I've come to terms with is I have to be okay with it being a challenging thing. I have to be vulnerable enough to have the conversations with Lucas about it, and I have to make it as safe of a space for him to be able to admit that it's a challenging thing, right? To move through. So I think it's just where we're at. I also it's amazing to me, right? Like, it's the Romeo and Juliet story, which, how many of us thought when they said, oh, that's an old movie. We all went to like the 1970s one in our mind, not thinking it was gonna be the one from Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes, right? But it's just a story, like, right? It's like the human condition again. It just can feel so individual, and yet it's the same experiences that we're moving through in different ways.
All I will add to that is I have really big feelings. And I think a lot of us have really big feelings, and I think that we've been trained to make them smaller, to compromise for others, and I think it's really just getting connected to that base, like you were saying, of those big feelings, right? Like, how we respond to things, if they're seen as overreacting, or really getting in touch with what that is, because that helps us relate to others and be empathetic. Even, I think as a kid, you're almost given more space to have that emotion and then express it immediately. You're like able to do that. And I think remembering that space we were allowed to be in, and what that means now as we try to be more conscious of others, but also how we feel. So there's my quick little thing.
I love that. Thank you. There's a scene in the film, there's a lot of scenes in the film that were hard to watch, but the deposition scene specifically is one that struck me as just like really uncomfortable, and kind of like dealing and talking about loss in such like a clinical way, and like devoid of emotion, kind of, for the purpose of law and whatever they were trying to do. And there's something that I guess the lawyer says to the dad after he's described this really traumatic moment, which is, "I'm sorry for your loss." And it just cut to his face, and I just felt like he was just so angry in that moment, and I was like, ooh, that maybe wasn't the right thing to say. She probably is sorry for his loss in that moment, but like, it just kind of got me thinking about, like, for people who are around others who are experiencing loss or grieving, is there, Juan, maybe I'll direct it to you, is there a right way to act or behave? Are there things that you're supposed to say or not supposed to say when somebody is dealing with a really difficult or tough loss?
It's interesting you asked me that, because I think sometimes there's this feeling that I even have about, as a minister, right? Like, how do I get somebody to see God in the experience? And, you know, and I think that sometimes it's actually religion, right? Or the faith of our upbringing that tries to diminish when we're feeling sad, when we're feeling angry, because it's not godly, it's not, you know, how we're supposed to, it's not grateful to God. And I think for me, it's been coming to terms with just being real and being vulnerable, and allowing myself to be real and vulnerable so that others can feel the safe space of being real and vulnerable. And we were talking about it earlier, like, you know, I was with a minister friend, they were telling me all these different things that were going on and trying to put a little positive, you know, spin on it. And I just looked at them and goes, that just sounds like it sucked. Like, that's awful. Like, that just sucked. And all of a sudden, like, she totally shifted. It's like, you're right. That was awful. And I didn't deserve that. And from there, I think then it opens up the space for even more.
So, thank you for that question. It's a great question, and it's a question I get often. So we, at CBC, we actually have a training. It's called a Grief-Informed Training Series, and this is part of session 1, is what do you say after a loss? And that's one of the questions when people ask me, like, what I do, they ask, like, I don't know what to say. You know, I go to a funeral, I go to a wake, and I don't know what to say. And number one, the most important thing to do is be there, right? Like, you be there. And one of the most horrible things that we heard in our training, actually, is we do a pre-evaluation and post-evaluation. There was a school counselor that actually said, I don't know what to say to a student after a loss, so I just avoid them. And my heart broke. I said, I couldn't believe it. And then went through the training, and after the training said, thank you for this training. I feel comfortable to be near students now. I'm like, oh my God, good. But can you imagine? I say this, and I say it with quite honesty. When I was onboarded as a CEO 3 years ago, I've been practicing as a licensed clinical social worker for over 20 years. And I was never trained in grief and loss until I was being onboarded by our clinical director. So I started my career in the Chicago Public Schools working with gangs. I saw more death than those of my peers who were working in hospice. And I had no idea that I was saying things fully wrong. And I'm sorry for your loss is such a slap in the face for people, and you saw it in Dan's face. Now, I'm not saying it's never appropriate to say, and you can. It's hard. It's a hard thing to say. So what do you say? It could be a whole bunch of different things. But just as an example, when you see the situation and you hear that, the first thing you do is you could just give the person a hug. Can I give you a hug? And oftentimes that's a really good thing to say. Or tell me about your son. And what is your son's name? That's often what I do. I start with that. I ask, what's your loved one's name? And just even saying the name is something, it's uplifting for them to say, acknowledge that you're acknowledging that person. So there's not always a right answer or a wrong answer per se, but it is a really hard thing to do. And the pressure comes when you think you're going to try to say the perfect thing or type it in a text message or an email or a little note. It's never going to be perfect. You just don't promise things you can't deliver. They're not coming back, right? And to a child in particular, we are very open and honest when we talk to parents. Don't say things like, Daddy went to sleep and he's not going to wake up, because that child is going to be scared of going to sleep. So you want to be real and use words like dead and death. And when you're talking to somebody who's experienced a loss like that, it's really hard to be that other person. But being empathetic and just saying, even I don't know what to say except I'm here for you, is perfect.
I feel like you guys sum up so many things. Like,
Maybe your personal experience when you were grieving, if someone said something to you that felt right or wrong.
yeah, I think we were talking about this before when we met up, but I think one of the best things that was said to me in a grief experience, it was actually like 6 years after my brother had passed away, and it was a close friend of mine. We had been childhood best friends, and our brothers were best friends, and it was my brother had passed away. And one of her older brothers, who was on the spectrum, very wonderful. We were sitting down at dinner, and it was 5 years after, and like there was nothing in conversation about my brother, and he just looked at me and he was like, you know, it really sucks that Alex died. And it was just like his mom looked mortified, but I was like, you know what, yeah, Jacob, it does really suck. And it was a really nice like moment, and he was like, it would be really nice if he was here with us right now. And I think what you were speaking to of like saying the name, even acknowledging the presence, even for people who have experienced loss like years after, I think it's been about 11 years since my brother passed. And so the moments in which the name is brought up are really sacred. And I know that for my family, I know that for my parents, but I remember when Jacob said that, and his mom came up to me afterwards, and she's been like a second mom to me. She was like, I'm so sorry. And I was like, no, that's the best thing that's ever been said to me about grief, because it did really suck. And it was really sudden. And to know that a presence is missed is really nice. And even when you don't know a person closely, you can ask, yeah, what were they like? You know, what were their interests? What were things? And then some people will really shut down. If they shut down, you go, no worries. You know, and you back off and you understand it's not about you. Grief is malleable. It changes, it transforms. You know, from one day, personal question can be great. On another day, it can make you cry immediately. So I think, you know, the perfect answer isn't there, but I think being there is the first step, you know? So yeah, that's from my personal experience. So
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I'll ask one more question. I do want to open it up to the audience soon. But I was thinking about everything that you all are saying and how it seems like everybody grieves differently. I know in different faith traditions deal with death differently, and we have different traditions for how to, you know, mourn somebody, how to bury somebody, how to pray over somebody. And I'm just wondering, if there's any, I don't want to use the words right and wrong, but if there are any tips on how to grieve in a healthy way. Something that struck me in the film was at the end when the mother said, I haven't even been able to start to mourn yet because I've been dealing with this lawsuit and trying to keep my family together. So I haven't even started my mourning process, and just, I don't know, it made me feel really bad for the mom in that moment, and made me think about how so many mothers are probably out there trying to do the same thing. And yeah, I just wanted to ask each of you, coming from your own practices and traditions, are there any tips or ways that we should think about how to grieve, or how to, again, not right or wrong, but just, you get what I mean.
I feel like I'm going to start with the Bereavement Center CEO.
There is no right or wrong. And I want to point out something. You as an individual can grieve differently by the loss, right? I might lose someone this year, and then next year, and then the year after, and all three of them could be very different. So being kind to yourself is really important. So let me start with that. I just want to point out, CBC has been non-denominational for 25 years, and our facilitators are trained just to let the participants speak, and they do. And in 5 minutes, you could hear someone talk about their faith, doubt their faith, go back to their faith, and in 5 minutes in group. And also, one other point I wanted to bring up, so at CBC, our model is not stages of grief. So when Kiva Ross made that years ago, that was actually about your own death and your own mortality. So we explained to people it's okay to feel, denial, acceptance, anger. You can go back and forth in the hour and a half of group. And so faith is very similar. What is healthy is anything that isn't going to hurt you, right? So obviously drinking, smoking, any kind of behaviors that's going to hurt you isn't good. Anything like we saw in the film, doing an acting class, or starting to draw or write, read, going to the beach, going to support groups, these are things that are healthy. In my tradition, so I am Jewish. My dad is Sephardic. My dad was Sephardic. My mom's Ashkenazi. But we practice Shiva, and that's the period after someone dies. You go to the person's house. My dad actually died during Sukkot, it's a festive holiday. So you actually there's no Shiva actually. It's receiving. And I always said that was so nice. I said it at the funeral that it was beautiful because my dad was such a happy guy. So when people came to my house, it was really awesome for his, and my dad's, because he's Cuban, he was Cuban, he had like 50 first cousins. So all of these people came over and were telling me stories about my dad through the years, and it was so healing. I mean, it was just to hear the stories, it kept him alive. So that really is true to any religion and any culture. You want to keep those stories alive. What hurts us is when you bury it. And when you bury it and you don't talk about that person, it, like she said in the movie, it really is harmful. It was harming her. It was very difficult because she didn't know what was right or wrong. And when we have parents call us, again, Children's Bereavement Center, people think, oh, it's only for kids. So they call, I want to enroll my child in a group. And we say, okay, well, we recommend parents come. So what we'll say, and Midge knows this, we'll say, well, no, I don't need that. I'm coming for my child. I don't have time for that. I don't need that. Well, we say, we really recommend that, right? Okay, fine. Do it for your kid. Just do it for your kid. So they'll come to group. They'll go to 1, 2, 3, 4. After months of going to sessions, they'll say, I finally get it. This is for me. And it is such a beautiful moment when you see that, because they are allowing themselves the space to grieve. And that's the healthiest thing of all, is giving yourself the space and the permission and the kindness to yourself. Anything you can do in between, whether it's art or drama or sports, it's going to be healing, as long as you're doing it together. You have to do it together, because nobody should grieve alone.
For those of you who may not be familiar with Unity on the Bay, it's a spiritual community that is pretty interfaith, intrafaith, non-denominational, and so it's interesting. You may not hear many ministers say what I'm about to say is, which I don't know what happens after death. Like I don't put a lot of emphasis for myself in trying to figure that out, whether there is like a physical heaven or if there is reincarnation. And to me, I think that opens me up to just realizing that it's not about right or wrong, right? And people can't, it's like, what is healthy for you? What does it feel like to you? And we have celebrations of life at Unity on the Bay rather than funerals. Which I believe can open us up to remembering, speaking about the individuals that we've lost from a place of celebrating who they have been. And sometimes I find that in that idea of celebration of life, we then also stop giving ourselves permission to just break down completely and cry it out and say it sucks. Right, and I'm upset with God, or I'm upset with life, whatever it may be, because just like for some people, the funeral can feel a little bit more just dense. This idea of celebrating life without honoring the fact that we're going through a grieving stage and trying to put the positive spin on it can also be as harmful. And so I've just been with so many families that will apologize for crying, or will apologize for not being able to just celebrate somebody's life in that moment. And it's do what feels, not do what feels right to you, just allow yourself to be in the space that you're in, right? Without making it right or wrong, and just feel into it. And I want to say, you mentioned NAMI. I'm very grateful. The person that brought NAMI to Unity on the Bay is here, Michelle. And Unity on the Bay, I believe that faith plays a role, and I also believe that mental health and counseling and therapy plays a role. And so I'm happy that Unity on the Bay is a partner of NAMI, and we were a sponsor of the walk that they just had a few months ago, because I think it all plays together. And I will say that one thing I do believe is important or powerful from the faith perspective, it's not just the faith, it's the faith community that's attached to it. And that to me is such an important part of Unity on the Bay. It's the community, it's the relationships, it's the individuals that can say, I have no idea what to say right now, but I'm here with you.
Yeah, I think, well, there's a lot I guess, so the question to repeat is advice on how to grieve from the faith traditions that we grew up in. Was that yeah, so I mean, there's a lot I could say is like, we haven't even touched on. my historian, that kind of background, I studied evangelicalism at Harvard Divinity School, so that was like my academic background. But I also grew up in it, so I think I think there's a lot of things I could say, and I'm happy to talk about afterwards with anyone about on that more historical ends. But I think within my own personal experience, just like build on that, is just to listen and to be there and not to fix. I think you mentioned this, but within, I think, growing up in my tradition, it was more, if you grieve, that means that God is not good. And I think that God can still be good, but grief can still exist, and there can still be suffering. And again, talking very specifically from the faith tradition I grew up in, but in evangelicalism, if you look at scripture, right, it's Jesus lamented. Like there was an active mourning, there was an active grieving, and I think allowing for that and allowing to sit rather than it to be fixed, which I think is something I already said already, is where peace and grace can be found. And I think something that would have been helpful in my own personal experience. And also, again, I think echoes a lot of the sentiments that have already been put forward. So, yeah.
Amazing. Thank you all so much for those great answers. I'm curious to know if anyone in our audience has any questions for our panelists or thoughts on the film that they wanted to raise that I haven't touched on yet.
Yeah, I do.
Should I just run this over?
Yeah, can you get you before this?
Hi, everyone. I want to bring up the topic of blame because that was very prominent throughout. It's a knee-jerk reaction, right, to blame someone and to lash out to someone. Could you address that? Because there was sort of a sort of a reflection of the father when he was doing the deposition that he then brought the blame to himself, where the whole lawsuit was to blame someone else.
Yeah.
So if you could address that issue, thank you.
Thank you. Who wants it? Great question from our audience.
Thanks, Rosemary. Yeah, I think when we are lost, from my personal experience, when we are lost in our feelings or when we don't know what to do with our feelings, I tend to, and I feel we tend to lash out or try to blame somebody. And sometimes we talked about this earlier. I think you had asked me earlier today, does death bring people closer to religion, for example, and faith? And sometimes it does. And sometimes it completely separates them from that, right? Because you blame God, you blame somebody else. Sometimes we feel too guilty about blaming God, so we blame somebody else, and then we can also blame ourselves. For me, what I have come to understand is that there are things that I just won't understand, and that's okay. And there are things that I don't need to fully make sense of, and that's okay. I think God is in the mess. I think God is in the unknown and the known. And I think God is in the questions also. So to me, that offers a space of not feeling as, not needing to place a blame on something that is happening. I will also say that I believe one of the things that I really love about unity and the unity philosophy is that, again, showing ourselves the self-compassion. We're always doing the best we could do. And there are so many things in our life that if we knew better, we may have done better. But if we would have known better then, we wouldn't have learned it, right? So it's like, again, the compassion, the kindness, the awareness that we're all sort of moving through this as best as we can. But I will say, it was interesting because I think now there's a lot of us that are trying to know better. And so when a child, when my 11-year-old has the issues where somebody kicks him out of a, text group, and it breaks my heart, I would imagine that before I may not have been as sensitive to that, and now I am, and so I'm more open about it. Thanks to people like your group and what you do at NAMI, It's like we know a little bit more on like what are some of the signs for depression, for example. And so now there are things that we can learn about so that when we do see children or our friends or our families, or even when we're going through it, we can name it. And once we name it, I think we are much more capable of doing something with that.
I had I guess to read it back to the movie, I had a really interesting emotional response with the deposition. Where I was just like, this poor girl, I had this, I felt protective of this, this young girl who was being put in this position of blame when she very vulnerably put up, right, I didn't want to wake up. And obviously, to bring it back to blame, it's not a blame to the father, right, of this emotional reaction of this loss of son. But I think when I think of blame in ways that I felt that in my own life, where I saw my parents especially carry that in their own life, you just don't want to carry it all. And I think there's an impulse for blame because you just wish that someone could take a piece of it. Whether it's God, whether it's this young girl, where it's someone, and I think there's just this desire, if you can pinpoint someone to own it, then maybe it won't hit as hard. And there are some very real situations where blame is necessary. I think that it's not to say that in all loss, I think there are blames, violent crimes, things like this. Blame is a necessary thing, but I think when you're feeling grief, sometimes you just hope someone can take it from you. And I think what we see in the film, when he says, it's not your fault, I don't blame you, there's this acceptance that he's going to have to process this himself, which was shown very clearly through the literal embodiment of Romeo. He had to quite literally take on the pain of his son himself. So that was kind of just my immediate reaction to it and seeing it in the film.
Since I'm passing it on, I'm going to take this moment to just, because when you mentioned seeing the young woman at the table, I'll be honest, at the beginning of the movie, I was placing blame on her, right? I didn't know the whole story, and so I guess that's also just something for me to take, is a lot of times when I do go into blame or wanting to blame, a lot of the times for me, I just may not know the full story. And so the more that I know, the more that I inquire, the more that I sit with it, I think some of that feelings of blame can dissipate. Maybe not, but it was interesting how I processed that through the film.
Thank you. Blame is very lonely, right? So when you're doing blame, it's very much to someone and to yourself. And in groups, what I always find fascinating is when you're watching the different participants speak, our groups are mixed loss groups, and that was created intentionally 25 years ago by our co-founders. So you could have lost by suicide, lost by homicide, lost by COVID. And why I bring that up is when I was a facilitator, I was fascinated in seeing how similar the blame and the guilt were for those who experienced loss, a loss by suicide or a loss by COVID. At the time I was just starting, it was 2021. There were a lot of deaths by COVID at that time. And that blame that they put on themselves, I should have known better, I should have done more, I should have. And what was helpful was hearing other people say it, because you're usually nicer to someone else, right? Don't say that to yourself, that's so mean, don't do that. But when you're hearing it, it's reflecting back at you, because they're going to say the same thing. And it's a very powerful moment in a group when you feel that, which is the community. Going back to community, being a part of a community is so incredibly helpful, and especially with blame. And that's, I think Dan really felt that by the end, because even in the scene where he's seeing, one person get, killed on stage and then another one get killed, it really was, it was part of his process. Obviously, we all saw it. He was grieving on stage. He was actually allowing himself to grieve, and he was releasing that blame for everyone. It was so incredibly powerful. It's a great question, and really, at the end of the day, it comes down to not just the loneliness, but that individual feeling of having to point your finger at someone, when really and truly, if you're within a community, you're realizing that you have to be kind to each other, and especially to yourself.
time for another question or? Oh, okay. Does anyone have any other questions? Okay, I see back there, and then I'll come up here. Do you want to run back there?
Where are we starting first?
Back there, and then back here, and then they'll probably kick us out after that.
Hi, good evening. Hi, Reverend. For me, it's just an observation of the lack of a connection throughout the family members. There was no, they were just basically existing. No one was chatting, but as he was healing, as the father was healing, even the wife was surprised when he kissed her, and there was more intimacy in the sense of, chatting or little gestures. So I thought that was wonderful. That's all.
Hello. My question is, you mentioned something earlier about suicide and talking to your child. I was just curious if you could give a little tips about it now, or if there are any resources to talk to teenagers. You're able to talk to them about sex. What is it, and how do you go about talking about suicide with a teenager?
That's a great question. Let me just point, who from NAMI's here? NAMI, someone from NAMI's here, you said?
Well, no,
no.
our director of operations, Michelle's here.
Oh,
who
okay.
Connected us with them.
Okay. I'll just start speaking while he's bringing it down. So the first and foremost, I'm going to give NAMI Miami a huge plug.
Susan Holtzman's their CEO. It's a phenomenal organization, and they do have a training actually. And there's, thankfully nowadays, there's actually a lot of trainings about how to talk to kids about suicide. First and foremost, it has to be discussed. My daughter is, well, I have two kids. So I have a 15-year-old and a 17-year-old. Last year at my oldest school, somebody they knew for a very long time died by suicide. And the very first thing I did was I talked about it. And it is so incredibly important to talk about it, because if you don't discuss suicide, then it becomes this mystery. And so you want to hear from them, right? And that's really important in general in death, and especially with kids and teenagers, is hear what they have to say, right? I always say you should limit exposure after a loss if there's a lot of publicity on it. And this is hard with social media, but to make sure after a loss, you just want to be careful. Like after Robin Williams died, we all knew what happened, and it was just so hard. But you have to be able to be comfortable within yourself to talk about it and acknowledge the truth, which is that this is a really hard conversation. And it's okay to have these hard conversations. I want you to know that if you are ever in a situation where you're feeling like you want to hurt yourself, come talk to me. And calling out and asking kids, when the kids are acting really horribly, there's some signs of suicide that people talk about all the time. When someone starts giving their stuff away, right? Like that's a big one, and they're just giving you stuff. And you can say, what's making you want to give away your stuff? I'm concerned about you. Talk to me about that. This is your favorite, car when you were little, and you kept it for all these years for good luck, and now you're giving it away. And to talk about it. My first experience with a child who was having suicidal ideations was I was an intern. I was only 22, and he was 7. And it was one of I had no idea what I was doing. I mean, totally honest. I'm thinking, social work school, they throw you right into internship. Like, what are they thinking? So I had to talk to the parents, and I had to explain the situation. And I said, he was a very bright child, and I said, let's be open and honest and talk. And he did, and he worked through it, and he ended up going to long-term therapy. I was a school social worker, and so he went to therapy. And he did well. But that is, first and foremost is being open and honest. But if you're really interested, go to NAMI Miami's website, and there's a free training that anyone in this room could do, anyone outside of this room could do. And they're all the time. Actually, I think there's one tonight. So you can go to that training, and I highly recommend it.
I was going to say that there were two scenes that I found interesting. One was in the amusement park when Christina meets Daniel, and he can't give her anything. He's got to walk away. But then in the deposition later, he makes a statement to her, "I'm glad you woke up." And I thought that was a progression, beautiful scenes.
Thank you all so much for being here, our lovely panelists, and our audience. Thank you for staying. I know it's a school night. Any final thoughts on where people can find you, where they can find your work?
Yeah, so I'm practicing artist, so you can find me at Kristina with a K and then Reinis, REINIS.com, and same handle on Instagram. But just my final remarks on this, it's really a lovely thing to talk about grief so openly. I think that it's really rare to have spaces like this to talk from experiences in all types of grief. So I'm really thankful for this, even as myself, to be a part of this conversation. So.
I'm very grateful. I'm learning. I'm in the process of it. I will say, please pick up one of these packets. Grief is as a spiritual practice on your way out. There's also a workshop that I am beginning. It's a 2-part workshop this Saturday and then 2 Saturdays called Healing Through Forgiveness. And it's actually, it includes emotional intelligence that was spoken about and where we feel the upsetness, where we feel the anger, where we feel the resentment, whatever it is that we may be going through, and how to process and move through that. So you can find more information about that at unityondebay.org. And I just do want to say, as emotional as I was throughout the film, what made me the most emotional was at the end, seeing the human spirit of the courage to heal through it, the courage to feel what they're feeling and to be vulnerable enough. I just really want to uplift that in all of us, right? That we do have that strength and that resilience and that courage to make it through so many different challenging and difficult things. And I think that's just a really beautiful thing that we can give ourselves more and more credit for, because it is within us, and we will make through so many of the challenges and difficulties that we may be moving through.
So we have flyers outside. Obviously, you had no art tissues are here. Please feel free to take more. It's very on brand. You can find us at childbereavement.org, and our Live from Loss programming is on there as well. We're free. We're year round. And we also have training, and we have conversations with CBC. We have lunch and learns, which are free to the community. And I always encourage people, because even if you had a loss 10 years ago, it's never too late to grieve that loss. And we have people who come to our groups at any given point. From the movie, that ending scene was very beautiful. And really to remember that you're not alone. And I repeat that to people all the time. You are not alone. Whether you're grieving the loss of a loved one, whether you're a caregiver for a disabled family member, whether you're going through a divorce, there's a community out there for you. And if we all felt more together, in the end, you will be able to feel a part of that community. And in your heart, you'll never feel alone. And that's so, so critically important. So please do reach out to our organization, share our information. And I want to thank you for being here throughout, but for you all for being so vulnerable and sharing your experiences. Thank you. And this could have been triggering. So if you need us, let us know. Thank you so much. Thank you all.